These conditions exact a massive emotional toll and also burden the health system with immense direct costs and economic costs with staggering productivity losses. Into this landscape enters psychedelic assisted therapy. While a lot of attention has focused on the scientific efficacy of these drugs, today we want to shift to a more financial and structural framing. While that efficacy is certainly intertwined with this discussion, today we will want to shift the focus from will this happen or should this happen to how is this happening. These therapies cost money. People will need to get paid. People will need to write the checks. So today we will be tackling that question. Who is going to pay for psychedelic therapies? To begin, we have a phenomenal group of panelists representing a broad range of expertise in this space. We'll have them briefly introduce themselves. Panelists, please briefly tell us who you are and a bit about your area of expertise as it pertains to today's topic. So we'll go in order. We'll start with Dara.
Thanks. My name is Dara Menashe, and I am the co-director of the Psychedelic Mental Health Access Alliance. And what that is about is as these therapies start coming into the US and the FDA regulated system, how do we make sure that Medicaid actually covers them? Not just covers the medicine, but covers the care model that makes them effective. I come to this field with an expertise in how do you get states to adopt best practices. I spent 20 years at the Annie E. Casey Foundation reforming child welfare systems. So what I'm bringing to the table is an understanding of how state Medicaid departments work, what they think about, and what it is that we need to do to make sure that they cover this for the lowest income population, which in many instances is the population that needs this the most. Thank you for having me here today. I'm looking forward to the session.
Thank you, Dara. Next is Sherry.
Thank you, Vincent. Hi, everyone. My name is Sherry Race. I am the CEO and co-founder of NPIA, and complementary to what Dara does, what NPIA does is work with employers and unions to integrate these innovative mental health treatments like psychedelic therapy into their benefits offering, making them accessible, making them reimbursable by insurance, and allowing people to access them without having to pay out of pocket. We've been doing this for now 6 years and have seen tremendous results and now cover 300,000 people across the US.
Thanks, Sherry. Next is Chris.
G'day everyone, Chris Rain here from Australia. I'm the co-founder and co-CEO of the Psychedelic Consultancy and the Peridot Clinic. We, over the last 6 months, have helped about half of the psychiatrists in Australia become authorized prescribers of psychedelic-assisted therapy. So we're the first country, and I think still the only country, for people to be able to access MDMA-assisted therapy outside clinical trials. So it's a growing kind of very small but important piece of this work. And we've also just treated, our first patient with that in one of our clinics too.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Next is Elliot.
Hi, everybody. I'm Elliot Marseille. I'm the founding director of a group at UC Berkeley called the Collaborative for the Economics of Psychedelics. My father was a psychoanalyst and used LSD with his patients in the late 50s and early 60s, and I was brought up in the Berkeley psychedelic counterculture, did many other things. And then 6 years ago, I started this group at Berkeley, and we focus on, as the name implies, the economics of psychedelics and particularly psychedelic therapies. And we're very much focused on providing the information that third-party payers are going to need to feel confident about covering these therapies and making them, and therefore making them accessible at a public health scale.
Great. Thank you, Elliot. So let's start our discussion, everybody. So to start, let's discuss how much this will all cost. I'm guessing a lot of the audience watching this got here because they experienced some sticker shock when researching these therapies. Elliot, you've published a number of reports on the cost of psychedelic therapies. To start us off, can you give us a ballpark figure at what we're looking at and provide some background on why that number might be higher than what many expect?
Yeah, I think I can do that. So I'm going to start with an answer that I don't like, and I don't think you're going to like it either, which is that we don't know what the ultimate cost of these therapies is going to be with any kind of precision. That's not hedging. It's a real feature of where the field is now. And the reason why there's so much uncertainty is that the two big components that constitute psychedelic therapy, the cost of each of these is themselves very uncertain. So I'm referring to the price of the drug itself, and I'm referring to the cost of the model for delivering the therapy. So clinician time, facility requirements, monitoring, screening, documentation, and this is an important one, whatever safety requirements the FDA puts in place through things like its REMS requirements. So what can we say with some confidence today? We can give ballpark ranges, and we can be clear about what drives those ranges. And this will get to the question you asked, Vincent, which is why the sticker shock? Because I think you're right. I think most people are a little bit surprised when confronted with the kinds of estimates of the cost that are likely to obtain over time. So if you look at the costing analyses that have been done on interventions in late stage clinical trials, the total cost is commonly in the thousands and even tens of thousands of dollars, not a few hundred. So let's take a couple of examples. MDMA assisted therapy for PTSD. Our own published work, which was based on phase 3 MAPS delivery of MDMA assisted therapy for PTSD, the total cost, and this includes now 3 8-hour therapy sessions and all the surrounding support, was about $12,000 per patient. That's largely clinical labor, the prep sessions, the full day monitoring for the dosing sessions, integration, and the infrastructure around that. That $12,000 is not a market price. We know this because there's no market for this yet. It's a micro.
Except in Australia.
I'm sorry?
Except in Australia.
Oh, yes, thank you. I'm talking about
Chris is keeping us honest.
Very good, Chris. I appreciate that. We don't want to be too US centric, right? Very good. So in the United States, at least, there is no market price for it. So the $12,000 is a micro costing estimate of what it would take to deliver the protocol. And the actual price is going to be higher or lower depending on wages, productivity, and as I mentioned, the FDA requirements. But it's still a useful anchor for understanding why these therapies are not likely to be cheap. Now, if you take the price of the drug, uncertainty really explodes. So for the $12,000 figure I mentioned on the price of delivering MDMA for PTSD, this was based on a very low estimated cost of the MDMA itself at that time. We were working with MAP, so we had a pretty good idea of what was possible. That picture has changed quite dramatically. So, for example, ICER's 2024 PTSD assessment, they used a placeholder cost of $10,000 for the cost of the therapy. And it was just they called it a placeholder, and that's what it was because the price and FDA indications were indeterminate. More recently, a study's been published, sponsored by Lykos, it was Lykos at that time, that assumed much higher drug costs. And I'm talking now about $12,000 a dose, so $36,000 for the drug alone for MDMA-assisted therapy. And if you include the therapy costs, we're talking about something like $48,000. So you could see why a member of the public who Googles a question or more likely goes to their friendly AI and asks about what the cost of psychedelic therapies are these days are going to get wildly different numbers because of the different assumptions about the price of the drug, the service delivery model. So the same therapy can look like something like $10,000 to $20,000 or more like $40,000 to $60,000. So I've been talking about MDMA for PTSD. I could also give you a rundown on the cost of psilocybin for depression For the interest of time, I won't go into details, but suffice it to say it's a similar picture with wide ranges of cost estimates used in the economic modeling. So, I think it's worth pointing out the obvious that one of the reasons that psychedelic therapy is expensive is it's not a pill, it's a bundle of service. It's a bundle of services. So it's not like filling a prescription for SSRIs. Even if the drug itself were very cheap, the delivery can still be expensive. And a key point here is that regulation will have a important role in shaping costs. REMS can protect safety, but can also lock in labor and facility requirements that raise prices and limit capacity. So just to be clear, I'm not arguing against safety, but it is a trade-off. So just, I guess to summarize, I'll just say that the clearest answer I can give is in the range of tens of thousands of dollars per course of therapy with wide uncertainty band. Whether this ends up as a boutique service for people who can self-pay or a broadly covered medical benefit depends on drug pricing strategies, how burdensome the REMS and delivery models are, and this is important, whether we adopt financing and contracting models like public-private partnerships of the type we're seeing now for Ibogaine at Texas. The taxpayers of Texas have allocated $50 million for clinical trials on Ibogaine. So anyway, the potential for public-private partnerships, outcome-based payments, and other financing arrangements that could bend the cost curve rather than letting supply and demand determine the ultimate price.
Perfect. Thank you, Elliot, for that background. And I really think also an added element there is the affordability of this is going to be dependent on people like our other three panelists. So I'm going to dig into this. Dara, Medicaid budgets are tight. Given the price range that Elliot just quoted, how do you pitch these interventions to state Medicaid directors?
Well, you don't start first with the price. Let me start with there. The first thing that Medicaid directors are going to look at, and the work that we're focusing on right now, is the FDA approval and the clinical trials aren't enough for Medicaid directors. They need to see that this can be delivered safely and effectively with the Medicaid population in real world settings. That often involves people with comorbidities, people with social determinants of health needs. These are not the people that are in the clinical trials. So it's really important that we start creating the care models in the real world settings. And when we're doing that, we're also taking into account how do we create models that are realistic for Medicaid to cover. Medicaid doesn't start with how expensive it is. Medicaid starts with, does it work for our population? And does it work for the people that we don't have solutions for first? So you start by going to Medicaid directors with, this is who it works for. It needs to also be really clear, who does it not work for? I mean, the way people often talk about psychedelics is it's great for everyone. Medicaid is going to need real clarity about who is it right for and who is it not right for. And very often they'll put in regulations and assume like you have to fail for certain things before you can get it for Medicaid. But the most important thing for us to be doing now is to create the care models with the community-based organizations that are serving this population so that we're able to show that this can be safely and effectively done with the Medicaid population. I will say the one thing that we will do once we do that, and this gets back to work we actually partner with Elliot, is we eventually want to look at cost effectiveness, which is not just does this treat the depression or the PTSD, what impact does that then have on healthcare costs? Because the biggest driver of healthcare costs are people with comorbidities, people who are not compliant with their diabetes medication and their heart medication. If we can show that people are healthier because they have psychedelic care and their physical healthcare costs go down, then Medicaid and a whole bunch of other MCOs, et cetera, will be really wanting to bring this into their practice.
So I can understand this paradigm where this is a high upfront cost, but it's going to decrease Medicaid costs down the line. I'm curious about this idea of braided funding that a lot of people are talking about, and that is asking the Department of Corrections or the Department of Housing to chip in because ostensibly we might be or psychedelic therapy might be addressing something that is going to ultimately have a cost there. Is that a potential option?
Maybe 5 or 7 years from now, but that's not where we're starting. Braided funding is really quite difficult. So it's just not where we want to start. The first thing we really have to do is show Medicaid directors that this works safely with their population.
Hmm.
I wouldn't start anywhere by trying to ask corrections or housing to start paying for any of this.
Great. Thank you so much. So, Sherry, let's turn to you. You've successfully gotten companies to pay for these therapies as a carve-out benefit. And just to kind of lead off for everyone, if you're unaware, there's a kind of a range of psychedelics. Some are not FDA approved, some are FDA approved, and so there's kind of some tricky nuance there. Can you tell us a bit about how you're getting employers on board for this?
Yeah, so when employers say yes to working with us, it's almost never because they're super excited about psychedelics. There are a few exceptions, but it's usually because they're stuck. They're paying for traditional mental health treatments that, for a meaningful subset of their population, simply doesn't work. They are on years of antidepressants, therapy, medication switches, in and out of rehab, ends up leading to disability and just no improvement. And that failure for with traditional treatments shows up very clearly in employer data. One of the most, I think, important data sets we reference when talking to employers and convincing them to work with us is the Milliman report, which looked at 21 million insured individuals. And it showed that the cost problem is very concentrated. 10% of patients drive about 70% of total healthcare spend. And more than half of that group has a mental health condition. And an even smaller slice, 5% of the total population accounts for 44% of all healthcare costs. And that 5% all have a behavioral health condition. So when we're talking to employers, mental health isn't just a carve out problem, it's a multiplier. People with untreated or poorly treated mental health conditions have medical costs that are roughly 3 to 6 times higher than those without. So if you have underlying depression and diabetes, treating your diabetes might be 2 to 5 times more expensive than if you just had diabetes and no depression. So when we talk to employers and unions, we're not asking them to add like a nice to have out there woo-woo benefit. We're showing them that a relatively small group of their employees is driving a disproportionate amount of cost and risk and disruption, and that traditional approaches are not going to change that trajectory. And so the pitch is just very pragmatic that psychedelic assisted therapy, when delivered in a tightly managed, evidence-based way, is a time-limited intervention that can meaningfully reduce symptom severity in exactly the populations that are the most expensive and hardest to help. So yeah, I think that's what gets them on board. Often the math, and then on the human side, just resonating with the suffering.
I'd love to be a fly on the wall with those sorts of conversations because that pragmatism I think probably is a great approach for this. I'm curious, what's the profile of a employer who says no? Is there hesitation financial? Is it reputational risk of paying for a taboo substance?
I think when employers say no, it's usually not because the numbers don't work. It, I think, falls into three overlapping buckets. I would say the first is just consistent or persistent miseducation and stigma. So even when we present really strong data, some people we talk to are just holding on to an outdated narrative about what these therapies are. There's a story in their head. It can be hard to get rid of that story. And when the evidence points in a different direction, they just don't want to accept it. I mean, this happens in life across many other realms, but the second bucket would be employers genuinely don't understand how much they're already spending on mental health. If I invite a CFO to the conversation, it tends to go a lot better, but CFOs don't usually agree to be in benefits conversations. But because the costs are fragmented across pharmacy, medical, disability, productivity loss, retention costs, they don't show up as a single line item. And so if we're talking to someone and they don't see the full picture, it's easy to say, oh, this isn't a problem for us. And then finally, I would say the biggest reason is just resistance to change. Implementing a new benefit, as I've learned over the past few years, is a lot of work. It's work for Anthea, but for the HR and benefits teams, it's a lot of work for them too to communicate this new benefit to their employees. These are real people with jobs and they're juggling multiple initiatives at once. They might be also implementing a new cancer program, a new fertility benefit. And even if they think this is a good idea, the timing might feel overwhelming. So yeah, it's less about it's too expensive or less about the reputational risk and more about we have too much going on right now.
I'm going to open to the next question up to the whole panel. We sometimes, I think, in the psychedelic space can take a very top-down approach where we focus on FDA-approved pipeline, and FDA approval can then trigger DEA rescheduling, and then there's a kind of a very specific pipeline with that also implicates insurance reimbursement. But I'm curious if anybody would like to add some nuance to this by discussing the state-regulated models, kind of this federalist approach that we're starting to see in states like New Mexico, in Colorado, and in Oregon, and how those might impact this payment scheme.
I'm happy to jump in. We're actually working with the folks in New Mexico. It's a really interesting challenge that they've created in New Mexico because New Mexico is different than Colorado and Oregon. Colorado and Oregon is all about self-pay. New Mexico is trying to integrate it into its healthcare system, and they're specifically trying to design it so that it works, that Medicaid covers it. Now, when I say it, let me be really clear. Medicaid is not going to cover a non-FDA approved medicine. But depending on how you think about the care model, and if you slice the care model into enough small components, Medicaid, given the current codes and the way it pays for things, can pay for the care model that goes around the medicine. They're also using the natural medicine, which is significantly cheaper than the pharmaceutical grade version of psilocybin. So they're creating what we hope will be a blueprint that other states or other medical systems will follow once there is FDA regulated access, to think about it both as a care model, but also to how do you fit it into the already existing codes and the ways that these kinds of services are paid for. Because integration and preparation are therapy, and those are things that are already covered by insurance. So Medicaid and commercial insurance. So it depends on how you code them. It depends on how you describe them in the system. So we're trying to make sure that the New Mexico system is written in such a way that it works with codes that already exist. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Elliot, as a follow-up to all of this, you publish reports that some of these therapies can be quite cost-effective, but commercial insurers worry about churn, and that is that they will pay for the cure and the patient will move on to a competitor in 2 years. Does your modeling account for that? Is there a way to mortgage the cost of therapy so that it follows the patient?
Yeah. So our models do account for that, and I'll say a little bit more about that, but let me just sort of talk about churn for a minute. Maybe not everybody in this conversation is familiar with the term. So it's a legitimate concern. Roughly 15 to 20% of privately insured people have a break in coverage or change plans each year. So the concern here is that a payer puts the bill for the large upfront cost of psychedelic therapies, but the savings in healthcare utilization that occur over time, they don't get that. So they pay for it, but they don't get the cost savings because the patient leaves. So that's the issue. And it's a legitimate concern. Nobody's being paranoid when they worry about this. So our models do account for it, but let me just say that our models and most cost effectiveness models take a broad societal perspective. And in fact, this is the recommended perspective where you're accounting for all the benefits that society could get. This is useful, it's important, we do it, and most cost effectiveness analyses do that. However, it doesn't help the payer who wants to know how their bottom line is going to be affected. So we also have a payer's perspective, which is very different and is affected by churn, as you say. So standard cost effectiveness analyses don't solve the churn problem, but our models reflect these concerns, and other models do as well, by taking both a broad societal perspective and a healthcare payer's perspective, including in the analysis short horizon budget impact, 1, 2, or 3 years. And then I think this really gets to the issue of concern, solving for break even. So doing a break even analysis, which determines when savings start to outweigh costs. So, is it 1 year or 2 year or 3 years, or how long is it after the therapy is received? And this is the kind of information that payers really need in order to feel, confident about of providing this coverage, particularly private payers. There's a nuance in psychedelic therapy that I think is worth mentioning, which is that it's likely that there will be substantial savings pretty early, because psychedelic therapies work quickly if they're going to work. So for those patients, it's possible that we'll see large reductions in inpatient care, emergency room visits, high-cost comorbidity care, expensive ongoing psychopharmacology early. So compared with standard prevention interventions, where you might not see the benefit until 10 years, psychedelic therapies, we may see them earlier. That's an empirical question, but I think there's a strong case to be made that will in fact be the case. There are ways that you can reduce churn by or the effect of churn on payer decisions by sort of innovative financial arrangements. Like, one thing that can help is to amortize the cost over, let's say 3 to 5 years. As sometimes you can make those payments contingent on the patient continuing to benefit. So this doesn't fully address the budget shock, and it doesn't automatically solve churn, but it does sort of mitigate some of the concerns that payers might have. More to the point, outcome-based contracts, I think, are something that we should explore. They're done elsewhere in the healthcare system, where if the effect wanes, the net price falls, so that the cost is tied actually to the health benefit. And then it is possible to have fully transferable liabilities. So think about a national or multi-payer pool where people pay up front into this pool, and the plan pays the premium. The plans pay premiums into the pool, and that way no insurer gets stuck with the cost. So there are ways to get around the churn problem. Really, the way to do it is have single payer. That's a longer term project.
Sure.
But I gotta put in a plug for single payer.
It would solve the problem, but I appreciate there's a economic pragmatism here, because it is ultimately, I think a lot of employers do want to try to do best by their employees, but it can be really hard to justify the economics here, or a lot of payers, not just employers. But to the point of employers, Sherry, does the employer model help to solve this problem? When you sign up a company, do they care about 10-year medical savings, or are they looking at immediate retention and productivity?
Yeah, well, I have to say I agree with Elliot. And yes, of course, my answer is going to be that employers solve the problem, and unions even more so. I agree with Elliot that if you model everything conservatively and look only at direct medical costs, especially for higher intensity psychedelic therapies like MDMA, the savings do take time to fully show up. And that's what the economic analysis shows. But what Elliot said about avoided ER visits, inpatient psychiatric stays, and rehab is how our employer conversations unfold in practice, and how we get them to say yes. because preventing even a small number of those events changes the economics very quickly. Those events can cost 30 to 40, even 60, 70K per episode. And where this becomes very tangible for employers and unions is, like you said, that the scope and time horizon for employers. The math isn't only about claims. It's about avoiding acute high cost events, reducing disruption in the near term, like fewer crises, fewer leaves of absence, better functioning at work. Even if they have churn in their employee population, some companies care a lot about the productivity of their team, even in the next 2 to 3 years. But for unions, and I'll say that, part of Inthia's success over the past few years has been partnering with unions. The alignment is much clearer. They're covering people over much longer time horizons, often for life, even into retirement and after retirement. And even if some of the medical savings accrue later, the value is very compelling because churn isn't the issue. Unions also have a culture of taking care of each other and treating everyone like family. They want to prevent chronic disability, repeated hospitalizations, and especially in blue collar and first responder populations, they want to avoid suicide. So I think it's the short answer to your question is yes. I think employers and unions solve this problem.
The union approach is one that I hadn't really considered, but as a former union member when I was a teacher in New York, that makes quite a bit of sense. Great. So I want to add a bit of nuance to this. Dara, can you explain the woodwork effect fear that states might have? And that's where you have a patient who is eligible for Medicare, and they might come out of the work, but they aren't necessarily claiming benefits, but they come out of the woodwork to claim benefits due to increased public awareness, outreach efforts. They see, oh, wow, this is available, and maybe I'm going to participate in this now.
I would say of all the things I worry about from a Medicaid perspective, people trying to get on Medicaid in order as a way to access psychedelics is not high on my list. It's really hard to get on Medicaid. There are very strict requirements. And so it's just hard to imagine that's like that you weren't on Medicaid and this is how you want to get on Medicaid. And quite frankly, if you're eligible for Medicaid and this inspires you to get on Medicaid, that's okay. But there are going to be plenty of gatekeeping that's going to determine whether or not someone on Medicaid actually gets access to PAT. There's going to be strict requirements. There's likely you're going to have failed other treatments before you get PAT at this point. This is why it's really important in the field that there are really good assessment tools and and tools to assess whether or not you're a good candidate. And this is also when I make a plea for how much we have to create these care models in conjunction with the community-based organizations that are already serving these populations. They are going to know who's ready for PAT, who's willing to do the work in terms of the change in behavior that psychedelics allows you to do. They're going to figure out how to integrate it into the treatment care that they're already giving this population. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't people that are going to try and get it and want it for the high, but that's what you need good assessment for, and you need good clinical guidelines as to who should have access and who shouldn't.
I'm curious, and I want to plug a bit of the work that you do on this with your organizations. How does some of the work you are doing, such as your Delphi data project, help to alleviate the fear that offering drugs like psilocybin will bankrupt the state program?
Well, the point of the Delphi process is to try and help the field develop some common variables across all of these studies and these projects that are going on. The way I describe it is fundamentally part of the problem is that there is an agreement about what's an adverse event. There is an agreement about what is the data that we should be collecting in order to say that this pilot is relevant to that pilot. So trying to do it so that we can actually do some meta-analysis so that the Elliots and the Sherrys can, they can have more of the evidence that we need to convince insurance companies to do it. That's the point of the Delphi process. The work we're doing with the pilots is really focused on creating care models that are more cost effective and that can work with the Medicaid population. And I say that, and this is where I want to put in a plug for philanthropy. Commercial insurance, there's a reason pharmaceuticals want to figure this out for commercial insurance. They're the highest reimbursement rates. Medicaid's the lowest reimbursement rate. There aren't the same market incentives to figure out what the care models are and how do we serve this population. So that's why we need the philanthropic dollars to fund these kinds of studies to show how and where it works with the Medicaid population. There just isn't the same commercial interest in doing it as there is for commercial insurance.
Great. Thanks so much. And I'll just note to the audience, I see the questions coming in, and we'll get to those at the end when we have a chance. But this is just one big plug, and I'll say this again. All four of our panelists are doing amazing work, and I strongly recommend you look them up and to see their work in their respective organizations for a lot more detail on the things that they're doing. All right, I want to look to pivot all the way across the world to Australia. Chris, Australia is from the future for the US. You've had legal rescheduling since 2023. Based on the first set of patients you've helped, what are the best approaches to provide broad access and not just create a luxury market?
Yes, thanks, Vince. So, yeah, my reflections will come from the place of, and we've now got a marketplace developing, and what are some of the early learnings that might be applicable into the US context that have been helpful. Firstly, I'll say, and for a lot of people on the panel and on the call, this is quite a revolution in the way psychiatry is delivered, in as much as it is really the first time that therapy and the drugs are coming together in a post-industrial model. So it's new for everyone, and that is fraught with challenges and risks and the necessity for cooperation. So firstly, I'd say our regulator really took a chance in allowing for this authorized prescriber scheme to exist. And the way it works is each individual psychiatrist needs to develop their own protocol, as much as like building off the MAPS protocol, but developing their own in their own practice, then get that approved by a human research ethics committee, and then get that approved by the TGA. So it's a lot of effort to go to provide this care for patients. And part of that is building a multidisciplinary team of therapists and the psychiatrists, plus the drug safe, and all the stuff that's required to be able to deliver this in your clinic is really difficult. So we've had the TGA allowed to do this. Some of the key things that's been helpful for our system is one of our national university, the ANU, set up a national patient registry to capture some of those adverse events and outcomes. And our first payer is Medibank, which is one of our largest insurers, is paying and supporting that, which is better for the whole system. So they're not just doing it to collect their own data, they're actually saying this should be available. And their intention is that ultimately some of this will be covered publicly as well. We've also had the Department of Veteran Affairs, which has come on board to provide psychedelic assisted therapy for veterans, and that's come through advocacy, and they similarly are encouraging people to contribute to the National Patient Registry. So far we've treated about probably roughly 200 patients in the country, and probably will grow, maybe to 1,000 patients, but it's still very tightly controlled in terms of safety and like structures around the patients, exclusion criteria, inclusion criteria. And we've had our first patients come over from overseas into Australia to access this care as well. So it's a very nascent market, but there's a strong will towards collaboration that this should exist for all people, and a willingness to share as much as possible. There's still fights that go on within the sector, but it's exciting times for Australia, and I think there's lots to be learned from it.
I'm curious about the real life costs. Reports that I've seen suggest that the treatment costs can be roughly 6,000 USD per treatment cycle. Is that accurate from what you're seeing, and how are you getting payers on board with that?
Yeah, so it's because of to Elliot's point, because of the multidisciplinary nature, and there's so many different moving pieces. For the first 200, a lot of each of those patients have been worked out. Okay, this is for you, and this is how it's going to work. And the psychiatrist and the therapist, like, how much do we get paid? What do we, there's a lot of moving things that are being worked out. Where it's sort of settled out is around 30 Australian dollars for 3 dosing. So the MAPS protocol for both those treatments, for MDMA and psilocybin, roughly thereabouts. And the costs in Australia are less the drugs, because we have suppliers that make it in Australia, and because it's pre-approval, there's no, they're providing that and under $1,000 per 3 sort of treatment cycle. So that's for 3. Then if the patient does a single treatment cycle, so 3 prep, single dose, 3 integration, that's roughly 10,000 Australian, which is $6 USD or $6 or $7 USD. So that's where it's sort of shaken out to. And I think it'll be like that. And because it's set up for really high risk patients, there's a lot of preparation, inclusion, exclusion. Like there's a lot of kind of control around it. It's for people like to the level of a fidelity of a clinical trial. That's going to be like that for, maybe hundreds of patients. But once that's there and there's data that suggests that there's no serious adverse events or where that is, it's managed well, then for patients with lower acuity mental health disorders, the innovation could occur. So perhaps with trials published around group therapy, with the use of technology, these costs, by removing some of the required therapist time, will continue to go down. Not, it's not going to be a hyperbolic reduction, but I think it'll be, it'll make it more affordable for people to access.
Can you tell us about the first payers and what can those working from the U.S. Working with the U.S. and in particular the U.S. Veterans Association, the VA, who seems like a promising first payer, learn from that rollout?
Well, the whole principle of how MAPS has gone about it, like focusing on veterans, using their stories and their advocacy to work towards this systematic change. I think that was at the core of how the DVA, our Veterans Association, ultimately we'll change this, because there's a lot of veterans like this works for us. We're doing it, outside the kind of regulated environments. We don't want to do it. We want to do it within, a safe environment where there's insurance and care and support. And so and I'd say within the DVA, there's a few folks that are really advocates on the inside to make this come about. And it's not an easy job for them to do. So when it comes to regulators or big payers, their job's not easy, and they're not there saying no for no reason. It's really helping them work out the systems without being too adversarial to go, this is how it might work. So DVAs come on, and so each patient needs pre-approval with the psychiatrist, their treating psychiatrist, and there's a whole bunch of exclusion criteria and inclusion criteria for them to access it. And each form has, it's difficult, it's not standardized, but each patient has a different form that requires different, like therapist rates and psychiatrist rates and drug costs, and, and they will pay for this and that, but they're doing it. I think it's hard to begin with, and it's happening. And then Medibank, our insurer, they're doing the legislative requirement in Australia is they can only fund hospital costs. So unfortunately, the psychedelic assisted therapy has to be in a hospital environment for them to be able to pay it. But that's just creating a sort of smaller market, but it's happening as well, and may change over time with better data.
I know that Dara mentioned that some of these state models can allow people to use kind of the proper ancient substance, and Elliot also alluded to the cost of the molecule versus the cost of the therapy. What are you using in Australia? What kind of MDMA and psilocybin are you using?
Yeah, well, GMP grade laboratory produced.
GMP, for people that don't know, is good manufacturing practice.
Yeah, so the drugs are not approved by the TGA, so they're not. It's sort of a bit of a carve out in terms of special access. The TGA, and I've had lots of conversations that they want it to be approved because it would make their job easier, but they also want patients to access these important treatments. Their focus is around safety, so there's some parameters around what it can be, but yeah, it's all synthetically produced molecules with oversights around quality control.
One last question for you. Do you see a lot of medical tourism happening? It seems like this is the kind of paradigm that would produce a medical, like a strong incentive for medical tourism.
Yeah, I mean, there's the protocols are really safe, and safe for people to do. So the inclusion criteria for patients is pretty clear. So, but yeah, it allows for patients to come out from Germany or the US to access particularly MDMA assisted therapy within certain guidelines. So that I think is hopefully the rest of the world opens up access to these therapies. But in the meantime, Australia's here for you.
Great. All right, I want to turn it back to the rest of the audience or the rest of the panel. So I'm curious about the equity and access piece here. I am very concerned about, I want us to avoid a two-tiered system where the wealthy get effective but resource-intensive therapies and the rest get cheaper and less effective treatments like SSRIs. So I'm going to go through the panel one at a time, and I'm curious your take on how we avoid that two-tiered system. So we'll start with Dara. Dara, is the key to equitable access to get public payers on board, or is it more nuanced than that?
So first of all, there will always be a two-tiered system or a three-tiered system. People will get boutique care who will get it. The critical thing is figuring out a baseline cost-effective model of care that Medicaid can afford. And so there is no way you're going to have equity and access without a Medicaid strategy and without creating the evidence that Medicaid needs with their population that shows that this is effective and it's safe, and then we'll move into cost effective. But without a Medicaid strategy and without the evidence that Medicaid needs, you will not have equitable access.
Great. Sherry, are employers the answer?
I agree with Dara. Employers by themselves are not the final answer. We also need Medicaid. Employers play an important role. They move faster. They help normalize these therapies. They reduce stigma by treating them as healthcare rather than something fringe. When employers cover this, it does get people talking, like boards, clinicians, eventually public payers. But at the same time, equity requires public players like Medicare, Medicaid, and the VA, and without them, access will always be uneven. So I think employers open the door, and then public payers are ultimately what makes these treatments durable and universal.
Great. Chris, will it be about price decrease, access increase? Curious your take from the Australian perspective.
Well, I also want to acknowledge, the first 200 patients that have paid for it out of pocket. These people are, long-term mental health conditions that have been devastating for them and their families. And the only way they can access it as it is until the payers have come on board is them paying for it and paying for the therapist and paying for the whole thing. And in a way, it's kind of a philanthropy because they're going first and they're building and they're investing their own experience and paying for it in order for the data to be gathered to then expand it. So without them, that wouldn't have allowed for the payers to come on board in Australia, which has now happened. I think with the data that's going to be collected through the national registry and employers or insurers in the US as they're collecting that data to prove the health economic value of it, that's going to be critical because it becomes more about value than cost, and the price reflects that. So I think that'll happen. I think also with the increase in technology and the ability for different trials to be placed into the protocols for different people to access with different acuity needs, I think that will also change the cost profile for different patients. I think it's a moving feast, it's a changing system. But I think there's a lot of demand from patients and people that want to access these therapies.
Great, thanks, Chris. Elliot, what about you? Is the key getting payers, regardless of who they are, to understand the cost savings?
Not exactly. Cost savings is great. We love it when the numbers indicate that there will be net savings. So they definitely help, but they're not guaranteed. And it's not the main bar for adoption. Dara made the point that Medicaid, for example, they're at least initially, their main concern is safety and effectiveness. Cost comes further down the road. But the larger point here is that people have the notion that if an intervention is good, it should save money. Very few health interventions save money. And yet there's this idea that psychedelics need to save money. They need to be good value for money, i.e., they need to be cost effective. Another way of saying that is that they generate more benefit than whatever the current standard of care is for the money spent. And that's a distinction that gets lost and sort of holds psychedelic therapies to a bar that's that's too high. So the key isn't getting payers to believe that they're going to save money. It's getting them to understand that psychedelic therapies can be cost effective. This needs to be demonstrated. This is an empirical, claim. That it is affordable. That the impact on, a metric like per patient per month premiums is something that they can accommodate. And that they will capture a sufficient number of the benefits over time, returning to this issue of churn. But that's a financing and incentives problem. It's not a scientific failure. So I guess the way I would frame it is that cost savings are plausible in some scenarios, and I think there's reason to be encouraged that we will see some psychedelic interventions that are cost savings. But the stronger and more defensible claim is comparative value. And I think we shouldn't overclaim or get ahead of numbers that would justify an assertion of actual cost savings. And we should de-emphasize, really as sort of a strategic or advocacy stance, I recommend we de-emphasize the possibility of cost savings. That's not the key metric here. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Perfect. Before we go to our final question, there is a question from the chat that I think I'm curious Dara's opinion on this. So this is from Julia in the chat. If the next psychedelic that comes before FDA does not include a psychotherapeutic adjuvant, which it looks like Compass's psilocybin protocols have not yet included, where might that leave payment reimbursement potentials for psychosocial support? And Dara, it sounds like those different supports have kind of been decoupled from the actual taking of the substance in the models in New Mexico. Is that right?
Yes and no. We are separating them from a payment point of view, but we are not separating them from the care model point of view and the way the whole model is being designed. This gets back to the implementation science pilots that we need to do. People often think once there's FDA approval, all of a sudden there's access. There's now an entire world of research that needs to be done about how do we get this into the real world settings. And so we have to create the evidence. We have to run the pilots. We have to show, and this is a belief at this point, that these medicines are more effective if you have these supports around them, if you have a care model and not just the medicine. Whether or not, however Compass gets it through the FDA approval, we still have to prove that. And we still have to show that in these pilots, and we still have to do them with the right population.
Great. Thank you. All right. Final question for the panel, rapid fire. If the FDA approved MDMA for PTSD tomorrow, what do you think the single biggest bottleneck that prevents a patient from getting treated next week? Is it drug supply, therapist availability, CPT codes, which are these insurance reimbursement codes, payer denials? Curious your take on this. We'll start with Chris.
I think the bottleneck that we're having in Australia is now therapist supply, and the way it works is you have a dyad, like those relationships, and these are all new models of care. So I would say, it's hard to really scale that up quickly because it requires relationships to be developed, and we're only just starting to build that. So I would say in the US, that would be a huge bottleneck to do it safely.
Great. Sherry?
Yeah, I'll piggyback off of what Chris said. And I'm sure Dara will add a lot more, but we don't have enough trained providers. And then it's also the provider capacity. MDMA therapy is not a 1 hour session that you're in and out. So even if we train a lot of providers, they can't see as many patients as they would if it was just typical psychotherapy. So both of those create huge bottlenecks in terms of access.
Great. Next to Dara.
So all the things you listed will be bottlenecks, but I would only add to it, what are the right care models? We don't really know what they are right now that take it from the clinical trials into the real world settings and for which conditions and which kinds of patients.
Great. And finally, Elliot.
I'm going to pile on with Sherry and Chris and emphasize the lack of trained providers. We already don't have enough skilled therapists in this country for people with mental and behavioral health problems. There's long waiting lists. Anyway, this is well understood. And so there's a dearth of people who are, are ready to be trained in this particular modality. The FDA denial of Lykos's application put a big damper on interest in the field. I'm pretty sure that what I'm about to say is right. You can check it, but I'm quite sure it's true that the number of applicants for psychedelic training programs has declined dramatically. And Sherry, I see you nodding, right? Yeah, I'm pretty sure this is correct. And I know also that quite a few facilities in Oregon have closed because they can't stay afloat for a variety of reasons we won't go into now. This also puts a damper on it, like in terms of people's willingness to take a chance and get this kind of training. So I really think that that's the single biggest bottleneck. Um, and and it can be ameliorated by the care models that we adopt. And, Dara was referring to that. And among them, of course, are group therapy models, which can have a dramatic impact on the reach of any given therapist. They can serve many more people per year. And one thing we need to know or reassure ourselves is that there would be no decline in the quality of service and the outcomes. Israel is now enrolling people in head-to-head trial of group versus individual therapy using something close to the MAPS protocol for the individual therapy. Anyway, yes, trained provider capacity, hugely important.
Great. Well, I want to just thank all of our amazing panelists and everyone in the audience here or watching the recording later. I just want to say that we can't answer all the questions in an hour here, but this payment thing is going to be a huge deal. And no matter what perspective you're looking at, if you're on a policy or a care provider, or no matter what, we hope that this has planted some seeds that can grow into expanding equitable access for these sorts of things. The four panelists here represent four broad range of backgrounds, and I strongly recommend you look at them up and the work that they do and the work of the organizations that they represent. So thank you all to our panelists, and thank you all for joining, and look out for our next activity or next presentation after this.